Juxtaposition is another convention that artists use to convey meaning. I call it an arty-farty word because the first time I heard it, I kind of laughed because it was so kind of cumbersome. But I got used to using it, and it just means that there's one thing next to another thing, like usually images. Could also be sculptural, though. And it could also, and we'll get more into sampling, you could argue that like rap and hip-hop, jazz, blues are kinds of juxtapositions of different sounds. So it's one thing next to another thing, usually images, for the purpose of creating an apparent or deliberate relationship between or among those things. We see this everywhere. When we go down the street, there are signs, there are road signs, there's advertising fighting for our attention. This is an artist named Joel Peter Witkin, and he is famous for creating these really striking combinations of images where you're not sure what was there to begin with. These are not photoshopped. They're usually composed still lifes, and they're photographed and processed afterwards. This is an incidental photograph by Barbara Norfleet. Just the juxtaposition of that model lounging there on the dashboard. This is apparently, she was driving through Northern California, I think it was. But she was driving through a patch of the highway that there was a fire, forest fire or brush fire, and the squirrel had fallen out of the tree onto her hood, and she just snapped a photo. I wanted to show you an artist named Romare Bearden. He's an African-American artist from the first half of the 20th century. And so when he uses the word Negro, he's using it as it's part of his historical location, right? My work has developed out of a response to a need to redefine the image of man in terms of the Negro experience that I know best. I felt that the Negro was becoming too much of an abstraction rather than reality that art can give a subject. So as an African-American artist, he looked around at the representations of Black life, and he was like, you know what, I don't see anything that I see. I just see all this negative stuff. And he wanted to recast it. And the way that he did it is really fascinating. Stuart Hall, this other quote down here, Stuart Hall is a cultural critic of Jamaican, I don't know if he's a Jamaican national. He was born in Jamaica, ended up living a lot in London, and he did a lot of writing and thinking about race and about how we signify race in the world, right? We tend to privilege experience itself as if Black life is lived outside of representation. Instead, it's only through the way in which we represent and image ourselves that we come to know how we are constituted and who we are. So Stuart Hall's making the assertion that how we represent ourselves is also a part of who we think we are. Okay, so what Romare Bearden did in the 50s and the 60s was he looked at popular culture like magazines, newspapers, ads, and he started to cut out images of African American people and re-put them together in a way that would show what he saw of his life, and not what the media was representing. This is called the Dove. Pittsburgh Memory. So what's neat about this is that Romare Bearden took from the very sources that he found to be inaccurate, right? He cut out those elements and repurposed them in an image, in a collage that had his own intent and reflected his own experience on the ground, right? When collage mixes with text, it can be really very powerful. And so what in a sense the artist is doing is they're mixing up different signs and manipulating not only the signs they're using, but also our understandings of those signs. This is an artist named Barbara Kruger. She worked for, I think, Mother Jones. She worked for a large magazine in the 80s. And she was one among the first to use the Xerox machine as a tool to create art. And also comment on, and this has recently become quite famous again, but this is created in the 80s, right? And she's also very famous for these red, very stark red, black and white images. The other thing I wanted to say about text is that oftentimes we live in such a text-heavy world that people will begin to associate the text with a kind of explanation of the image, so be mindful of that. Images can also refer back to other images, or better, to other representations, right? So just to forward a point, political propaganda, which we'll cover soon, and advertising, which we also covered, are really good at this. So for example, this is when the new Volkswagen Beetle came out. I don't know if any of you have seen Mad Men, but the ad up in the upper left-hand corner, if you watch in some of the earlier episodes, I remember them going on about Volkswagen. And they're sitting in the office smoking and drinking or whatever they're doing. And they're sort of like beside themselves because keep in mind that when the Volkswagen came out that was up in the upper left-hand corner, it was in the mid-50s. That was only 15 years after, if that, 10 years after the end of World War II and the end of Nazism, right? And this car, the Volkswagen, the people's car, was commissioned by Hitler from Ferdinand Porsche he wanted to have everybody have a car, the people's car. So they made this really cheap little car that the German people could, invest in and have and sort of represent their modernness. Now, the ad up in the upper left-hand corner was unique because advertising at this point was very embedded in reliant upon the part-to-whole relationships, the associative relationships, and it was about the life and about the representing what this object could do for you. And we'll go more into that in advertising. This is sort of an anti-ad. And lemon, of course, is like beater or junker or whatever. Lemon was the common term for just a pretty crummy car. And so the Germans, when they put this advertising out there, they were kind of like hand in hand, like, yeah, we were defeated during World War II. We have the industry to create all these cars. We're trying to get our economy back on a solid footing. And this was one of their first forays into selling this car, right? So they went low brow with the ad. And that was seen as very, very controversial, very edgy, and that kind of thing. Hence the Mad Men reference. When the Beetle went out of production in the 70s, well, I guess it kept in production for quite some time, but the styling and all that kind of just stopped. In the 80s, when the new Beetle came out, you can notice that what they're doing here is they're not only restarting this project, but they're also borrowing from the very early advertising. And so you can see it's the same font, practically the same stance of the car, and it still has that real simplicity. So they're not only trying to restart the Volkswagen as a car, they're also saying, look, we can be just as edgy as we used to be, and here's our new go at it. Sometimes people will make fun of ads, right? So Tommy Hilfiger, follow the flock. This is from Adbusters. This is also from Adbusters. So again, playing around with customary expectations of ads. These are all from Adbusters. This is a collage of a bored, super fashionable model, and then of course the juxtaposition of the destroyed city in the back. Advertising can also start to mix customary associations of representations. So Joe Chemo, which is a kind of a, this is Joe Camel, of course, was the original Camel cigarettes ad. It was a way of appealing to children because the cigarette industry was trying to get more customers. But then people started to culture jam it and started to do spoofs on it, and they came up with Joe Chemo. This is an artist named Carrie Mae Weems, and this is a series that she called American Icons. She's an African American artist, and she's also her photography. What's unique about her work in the late 80s was that the role of the author and the role, or at least the kind of the heritage of the author became really important. And so what does it mean? So one of the questions she has is, what does it mean for an African American woman in the late 80s to be photographing representations of race in this way that are still pervasive throughout in these sort of innocuous ways, like they're holding your mail, or they're holding your pencil holder or something like that. So she did a whole series on this. But again, like, the context of these images, they're not simply what they seem, because part of one of the juxtapositions here is time and place in history. Okay, so we're going to do a little read, and I wanted to show you I'm going to show you a piece of propaganda. And but before I do that, I wanted to kind of prime you for it. This is the Venus de Milo, and it's in Italy. Very, very famous statue. It is lauded as one of the more beautiful statues, some kind of icon of beauty, whatever you think about that. And here's the propaganda. And so if you want, you can pause it, and I have a couple of questions for you. One question is, when is this propaganda? And then how do you know that? And then what are some of the tropes, or what are some of the underlying messages inherent in the propaganda? How do you know that? And then what do those assumptions about this person in relative to the Venus de Milo for $2? What is this propaganda trying to say, and who is it saying it to? Okay, here's another one. This is Evita Peron, and she fought for women's rights in Argentina. And this is Che Guevara. Whatever you think of either of these individuals, Che also did the same thing. He fought for, unfortunately, he collaborated with an enemy of the United States, which was Fidel Castro, but he did fight for the everyday person in Cuba, and therefore was lauded as a everyman, somebody who fought for every person. And this is something from communist Russia, very early imagery. And I'm showing you this, again, I'm priming the pump here because I want to show you this. And hopefully it'll play. Oh, bananas. All right, well. Well, this is, I'll put the link in our Canvas page. But this is a late 80s ad of Taco Bell. And I'll show you, I'd like you to go and look at the video, but this is the Taco Bell Chihuahua. Made a lot of people upset because it really did associate Mexicans in particular with Chihuahuas. It kind of generalized Latinx culture, and it also associated gorditas with some kind of a revolution, and it used the iconography of that stuff that I was just showing you as a kind of a reference. So it was a part-to-whole relationship. It was a good example of synecdoche, part-to-whole relationship, and it happens kind of under your radar. So when we see the little Chihuahua wearing a beret, we think, oh, maybe that's like Che, or maybe that's what revolutionaries wear. Then there's the mic, and you'll see in the advertisement that there's this whole Perón style speech given on a balcony, and the supplicant, crowds cheering for a chalupa. Okay. Whoops. So there are other ways of creating messages or images, and but in the next few slides, what I want to try and demonstrate is the ways that you can make them. So I want to go over some of the visual definitions, or the definitions of these tropes, which we're going to use. Okay. So I've mentioned this before. Semiotics is a very rich field of study that looks at how messages are sent and received. It's a study of signs, and even regular signs you see every day. And these are some of the conventions that are customarily used in those signs. A metaphor. A metaphor is one thing that makes you think of another thing because the two things have a common characteristic. For example, if I say he was a mountain of a man, we understand that the man and the mountain share characteristics of hugeness or maybe steadfastness. So even though they're very different, we draw the two together. So I'm going to show you some art. I'll show you some digital examples of student work too. But this is some contemporary art. This is Do Ho-sa. He's a Korean artist. Some and One. And in this is an installation, and you can see all the silver tabs are dog tags. And his work has been occupied with notions of home. And he's South Korean. They have a conscription military, and he moved from South Korea to the United States, and he just felt really out of place. And so you can see you're walking on these dog tags, and you walk around, you can go inside, and then there's imagery inside that you can see. This is another image. This is by David Hammonds, and he did a series called Spade. David Hammonds, an African-American artist. He couldn't figure out why why the word spade was used to represent African-American and black people. And so he literally took the spade, which is a shovel, and he created representations with common objects that referred to the majesty of African mask making. Okay, irony. Irony is a mode of speech in which the meaning is contrary to the words or actions spoken, and it's saying one thing and meaning another thing. This is an artist named Jeff Koons, and Jeff Koons was and is a very famous kind of pop artist, I want to say. Very savvy, business savvy. This is Michael Jackson and his chimpanzee Bubbles, who was notoriously very reactionary to visitors other than Michael Jackson, very violent. And this is a really large sculpture, and this was done in the early 90s. The sculpture is huge, and at that point he was like massively popular. He had just recently done a world tour, like in Russia in '88, I think. Anyways, the point of the irony here is America's obsession with fame, America's obsession with a certain type of fame and a certain representation of talent, but then also the comfort that he had with representing it in an ironic and almost kind of a snubbing kind of way. Like it's kind of disrespectful is what I'm saying about the amount of creativity that this person had. And synecdoche is one thing that makes you think of another thing because of the one thing is a part of the whole of the other thing. And it's a triggered response. So things are equated with other things, or they're associated with other things because of their relationship is a piece of that larger image, right? So this is an image by Andy Warhol. It's called 16 Jackies. And Jackie Kennedy, previously Jacqueline Onassis, very wealthy, from a very wealthy family, was the wife of John F. Kennedy, the assassinated president of the United States. And so you see here that, on the one hand, Jackie Kennedy represents in some of these, a very happy, smiley face. The name alone represents wealth and this kind of like American royalty type thing. And then you start seeing these images of her accompanied by an officer in dress that reminds you of a funeral. And so all at once, what Warhol's doing here is he's using synecdoche intentionally. He's saying, look, we have created these representations of what we value, and it's so embedded in our culture that he doesn't even have to explain what's going on. All he has to do is just use Jackie's image in different stages of her life. And what ends up happening is we don't look at this as a portrait of one person. We look at it as a portrait of an entire nation and also an entire presidency and an assassination and so on. Metonymy is one thing that makes you think of another thing because associations are triggered. And one thing leads you to think of another thing because of the ideas you have about that thing are similar to your ideas about the other thing. So for example, if I say cat, you might say mouse, right? So the difference between synecdoche and metonymy is that metonymy in metonymy, the word that you employ or the image that you employ is linked to the concept that you're really talking about, but it's not actually a part of it, right? You can think about this like in advertising where somebody will put like face cream next to a bunch of roses and crystal, and then there's an association between luxury and this cream, right? And so when we talk about stuff like, in quotes, the crown, you mean the royalty of England or the Oval Office to stand for government, right? This is an early ad from Coca-Cola. I'm kind of softballing it here because these are easy to pick apart. But Coca-Cola is using metonymy here very, very deliberately, invoking, perhaps young love of a particular type, of a particular socioeconomic status. And then also in the background with all the red and the hearts and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. This is an artist who used who at a certain point in time, Marlboro was really famous for creating this sort of macho man kind of cowboy macho association with smoking cigarettes. And this is an image. What he did was he just used the image alone without using any of the Marlboro stuff, and he would actually stage these. And so one of the things that he tried to do was to point out to us how much real estate or how much space in our memories some of these visual associations occupy. So we might think about, if you were of a certain age, you might think about, cowboys smoking. And he was just trying to point out, like, look, you don't even need to see the ad in order to understand that Marlboro, as a company, has taken an image and occupied it with its identity, so that no matter where you are, you might be out driving in Wyoming and go, oh, look, those look like the Marlboro men, or those look like the smoking cowboy guys. So it's a way that metonymy can create associations that can be embedded culturally. And this is another ad, but again, it's a clothing ad, of course, but there are very simple cues in the image that create an association between the clothing and a certain type of lifestyle. So it's kind of obvious. Okay.